From a psychological standpoint, Dominic Caruso is not simply a powerful man falling in love. He's a subject shaped by generational violence, emotional suppression, and a lifelong belief that protection must come through control. That is precisely why Clara becomes such a destabilizing force in his life. She does not fear him in the way others do, nor does she worship the power he represents. Instead, she responds to the wounded human being beneath the title, and that creates a rupture in the identity he has built to survive. This is where the story becomes deeply unsettling and fascinating. Every gesture of care from Dominic feels sincere, but it also raises an uncomfortable question. Is he loving her, or is he binding his sense of redemption to her existence? Once his enemies begin watching Clara, the relationship turns into something even darker, a psychological pressure chamber where devotion, trauma, guilt, and possessiveness all collide. And that is what makes the audience stay, not just to see what happens, but to understand what kind of love is possible when both safety and danger come from the same man.
Clara Bennett was a study in social paralysis, an island of absolute stillness within the kinetic swirl of a Manhattan penthouse. For 45 minutes, she had not shifted, her grip on a glass a desperate anchor as she observed the room's elegant predators and felt her own presence dissolve. This ordeal was set in motion 3 weeks prior by an unsigned cryptic summons, a gilded bait cast into the waters of her life. A nursing student accustomed to scarcity, she was now an anomaly among titans, a juxtaposition so severe it felt like a deliberate exercise in cruelty. The dress, a thrift store find she had meticulously tailored, now felt like an indictment. Every seam broadcasted her otherness, reinforcing the internal monologue that she was a common sparrow adrift in an aviary of magnificent exotic birds. A thoughtless collision from a passerby, devoid of any apology, became the final psychological blow. It ratified her status as invisible and ignited a visceral impulse to flee, a survival instinct to escape before her spirit was completely fractured. This had to be an error, she reasoned, a logistical blunder, any narrative to balm the sting of humiliation. As she moved to retreat, she was utterly unaware of the observer above, a silent predator watching the opening move of his meticulously crafted game. From a balcony, Dominic Caruso observed her. It wasn't her appearance that captivated him, but her unfiltered, raw authenticity. In a space saturated with performance, her genuine unease was a beacon, singling her out as a fascinating deviation. For a full hour, he had catalogued every minute sign of her distress, her acute isolation. He read the defiant posture of her exit, not as surrender, but as a strategic retreat, and his move to intercept her broke his own rigid principle of calculated non-intervention. In a single moment, all his cold, precise scheming was cast aside. He moved to block her exit, his voice a low vibration as she reached the door. Leaving so soon? To her, he materialized as an immense shadow, a physical monolith obscuring the light. His gaze was a palpable pressure, pinning her to the spot. The voice she finally found was impressively composed. "I noticed," he said, his words a strategic masterstroke that both acknowledged her distress and asserted his unnerving total awareness. The party's clamor faded to a muted thrum as blood roared in her ears. Her confession of feeling out of place was countered by a revelation that seized her breath. "And yet, here you are, in my home." The world reeled on its foundation. When he introduced himself as Dominic Caruso, a name she recognized as a signifier of immense power and fear, a chilling cold permeated her being. The man from the society columns, the architect of this whole scenario, was standing before her. This man was far from the remote corporate entity she had envisioned. He enveloped her hand in his, a prolonged contact that dismantled her personal space. His next words were like a blade, shearing away her anonymity. "I know who you are." He framed the entire event as an act of repayment, a debt of gratitude, a flawless, disarming manipulation. His surveillance was recast as concern, transforming him from predator to protector with one sentence. "You're the woman who saved my mother's life." Her mind drew a blank. the event completely absent from her memory. He supplied the details: Bellevue Hospital, the surrounding chaos, her own composure, exhibiting a terrifying intimacy with her history and seizing control of her personal narrative. Mrs. Romano, she finally breathed, the name emerging from a mental fog. Her angel in blue, he affirmed, the term laced with a worshipful reverence. It was the first shimmering strand in a web of idealization he was weaving around her. I was just doing my job, she countered, attempting to ground the situation in mundane fact. He waved her reality away with a grand, absolute rejection, replacing it with his own emotionally charged saga and altering the very texture of her memory. He offered the opulent gathering as a tribute, only to dismiss it with theatrical scorn, a tactic to instantly align himself with her feelings of alienation. This classic maneuver created a common enemy, drawing her in while isolating her from her surroundings. He spoke of the other attendees with disdain, labeling them hollow and superficial in a performance meant to elevate her by contrast. She felt an unexpected warmth, not insult, as the first fragile link of a destructive bond began to form. Stay, he urged, his tone imbued with a surprising vulnerability, a masterful artifice for a man of his authority. He claimed he merely wanted to know her, an appeal to a profound need for recognition she hadn't realized she possessed, and she yielded. She had no concept that she was conversing with a monarch of the city's criminal underworld. Her decision to remain was not a choice. It was the quiet click of a lock on an ornate cage, a descent into a world engineered to dismantle and rebuild her. 1 hour, she bargained, a final, desperate attempt to retain some fragment of autonomy. The flash of victory in his eyes confirmed he had already won. He guided her away, symbolically extracting her from the known world and into his own dark sphere of influence. His private study was a meticulously staged illusion of comfort and normality, a sharp contrast to the party's cold grandeur. Family photos were artfully placed to construct a facade of an ordinary man, designed to dismantle her defenses. He indicated a picture of his niece, Isabella, employing the child's image as a moral shield for his true intentions. It was a calculated bid for empathy, reframing his obsession as a noble drive and concealing the pathology that lay beneath. His refusal of alcohol signaled a man who required unwavering control. As he passed her a glass of water, his fingers made deliberate contact with hers, a fleeting spark of intimacy meant to bypass her intellect and appeal directly to her senses. He inquired about her history, and she offered it to him, one painful fragment at a time. The narrative of her orphaned existence and unending struggle flowed from her, unwittingly delivering him the keys to her deepest vulnerabilities. While she spoke, his concentration was absolute, his gaze unblinking. It was not the expression of empathy, but the sharp, evaluative stare of a predator cataloging her wounds, identifying the exact fractures he could exploit later. He labeled her trauma, real pain, and her endurance, grace. He reframed her entire past as something poetic and heroic, a powerful act of validation that positioned him as the only person capable of truly comprehending her soul. In that instant, she felt an intense connection, a sense of being truly perceived. When she inquired about his own suffering, he deflected with an enigmatic smile. It's a complicated answer, he said, deepening his mystery and reinforcing his control. His own story was a masterpiece of self-justifying pathos, depicting his brutal existence as an inherited burden. He cast himself as both victim and hero in his own epic, a narrative engineered to elicit both her sympathy and her admiration. "You're lonely," she observed, the words escaping her before she could retract them. His feigned astonishment at her perception drew her further in, making her feel uniquely insightful as the hours dissolved under the hypnotic force of his attention. A telephone's sharp trill shattered the enchantment. Her move to depart was countered by his perfectly acted reluctance. His insistence on providing a car was not a courtesy. It was a final assertion of control, a tether ensuring his influence would follow her into the night. After a silent, internal war, Luca gave a slight nod. A life defined by want compelled her to reach for this perilous, magnetic man. Vittorio led her away, his hand hovering at her lower back, a phantom touch that implied ownership. His voice was a soft command veiled as a confession. "I need to see you again, Luca Bennett." He portrayed himself as a casualty of his own station, a classic tactic for manufacturing a swift, false intimacy. Luca's heart beat wildly against her ribs, a frantic, caged thing. Every instinct screamed a warning that was at odds with the intoxicating power of his words. Yet an inner voice romanticized the descent, viewing this risk as the sole path out of her colorless existence. She gave him her home address and her work hours, effectively handing him the blueprint to her confinement. Vittoria's responding smile was that of a hunter who has just cornered his quarry. "I'll see you Tuesday, Luca," he declared, each syllable cementing his dominion over her. She would later recall his inscrutable expression as she was escorted from the room, her trip home a disorienting haze, a vortex of thoughts that left her breathless. In her psyche, the event was no longer a simple meeting, but an ascension. She had been plucked from obscurity by a figure of immense power. This cognitive distortion, this fragile concept she termed a chance, became the first strand in the inescapable web of a trauma bond. She interpreted it not as a threat, but as fate, a dangerous narrative the mind creates to justify a perilous connection. If the anatomy of Luca's subsequent unraveling is of interest, the following scenes will lay it bare. Her memory of that next Tuesday is colored with the soft tones of romance, a recollection edited by desire. In the following days, Luca existed in a fever dream of obsession and fantasy, replaying their encounter until it took on the quality of a film scene. She told herself Vittorio would not show up, a flimsy psychological shield to protect her from the acute pain of his potential rejection. She rationalized it with the cold calculus of class and wealth, a desperate attempt to restore her predictable reality. She then submerged herself in the numbing ritual of her job, using its familiar rhythm to quiet the storm within. Her coworkers a pale substitute for a real family. As resignation settled over her with the passing hours, a quiet surrender replacing hope, the clock struck 3:15. At that moment, Vittorio arrived, not as a man, but as an event, obliterating the calm. He commanded the doorway, a figure whose sheer presence arrested time, radiating a power that was both total and chilling. Vittorio executed his part with chilling precision. The room of onlookers dissolved as his focus narrowed entirely on Luca, crafting a bubble of intimacy amidst the crowd. With composed words, he cemented their agreement, and the ambient noise of her reality receded into an insignificant murmur. A potent silence, thick with his authority, descended. To her breathless disbelief, he offered a vow cast in iron. "I always keep my promises." Unmoved by their collective gaze, he was the very picture of composure. Luca fell back on professionalism, her final shield against the encroaching turmoil. The tremor in her hands betrayed the fear hidden beneath her practiced calm. "You carry yourself with more certainty here," Vittorio observed, his tone a silken blade, positioning him as her sole confidant and forging a deeper, unseen connection. His voice acted as a salve, and her composure shattered. Luca revealed the specters of her history, of hardship and suffering. He seized her vulnerability, mirroring her scars as his own. Then his laughter, an unexpected sound, cracked the monstrous facade she had perceived. A psychological partition formed in her consciousness, cleaving the man from the monster. Over the following hour, Vittorio conducted a meticulous excavation of her psyche, charting her aspirations, anxieties, and attachments, all masked as casual dialogue. As she shared the small comforts of her life, he inclined toward her, his focused gaze a flawless pantomime of deep fascination. He presented his own past as a polished narrative of intellectual achievement and unwilling obligation, engineered to elicit her empathy. He invoked the memory of his mother's cooking, a calculated detail meant to manufacture an immediate, baseless closeness. The passage of time seemed to distort, creating the illusion of a long acquaintance. Then came his soft-spoken directive, "You'll join me for dinner." She recognized the precipice and the fall it promised, yet her emotions had already taken the plunge. Reason had only ever been a path to solitude. He mirrored her own professed love for authenticity, cementing a perfectly engineered and completely false sense of compatibility. As they moved through the city, he gradually closed the distance between them, a quiet encroachment into her personal space. Her awareness contracted to include only him, the bodyguards trailing them becoming mere specters. The family restaurant was a carefully chosen set, designed to project a manufactured sense of security. The restaurant's atmosphere was warm, deceptively so. The owner's greeting confirmed the artifice. The woman's use of his surname was devoid of warmth, a cold recognition of an established authority that required no introduction. Vittorio managed the exchange with the finesse of a grandmaster, invoking his father and complimenting the cuisine in a masterful game of social control. He guided her to a secluded table, a private stage for his impending performance. In that moment, Luca saw him not as a man, but as a sovereign holding court. Disparate pieces of information began aligning in her mind, forming a grim pattern that led to an unavoidable conclusion. Vittorio commenced his confession, draping it in remorse, speaking of things I am not proud to talk about, to frame himself as a figure of tragedy. He was, he confessed, not the man he appeared to be. In response to her query, he spun a narrative of legacy, of an empire founded upon methods the law tends to frown upon. He presented his existence as an inescapable fate, thereby erasing any notion of personal culpability. A chilling dread seized her, yet her gaze remained locked on his. He articulated the nature of his world with the detached, sanitary language of corporate strategy. He extended a rationalization, a fragment of plausible respectability for her to hold on to, a justification to remain. Upon her uttering the term crime lord, he offered a gentle emendation. He was the head of his family. This semantic shift detached the violence from the man and attached it to the position. Her impulse to escape became a faint signal, overridden by the sheer weight of his persona. She interpreted his stark admission not as a red flag, but as a demonstration of deep respect. Vittorio then invoked his mother, cloaking his coercive tactics in a veil of sentimentality that effectively blinded her. He offered a false dichotomy, remain or depart, now possessing the truth. The offer was a test, a veiled challenge to her resolve. With the waiter's arrival, she grasped a piece of bread, a simple, grounding action in the midst of psychological chaos. Her thoughts fixated on the sliver of legitimacy he offered, the single point of light in the gloom. Vittorio expanded on this, fabricating a narrative of noble purpose centered on protecting a young cousin. He assigned a righteous motive to his malevolence. He probed her limits with a subtle intimation of his capacity for violence. She responded by blurring his moral lines, her own traumatic history providing the framework to perceive him in shades of gray. "Nobody is just one thing," she offered, granting him pardon. His gaze was a cold evaluation. Vittorio commended her lack of fear, elevating her as exceptional, as worthy. In that instant, Luca abdicated her moral authority over him, her own brokenness becoming the currency for entry into his world. The ensuing conversation felt lighter, yet a palpable darkness now occupied the space between them. He then delivered his biography, edited for maximum persuasive impact. A villainous father, a saintly mother, and a vulnerable niece, designed to trigger her protective instincts. This, combined with accounts of his austere self-discipline, finalized the portrait of a man too nuanced and tragic to be purely evil. It was then Clara's turn to confess. She spoke of the persistent guilt and nightmares that plagued her after her parents' deaths, admitting her career was the sole structure preventing her from unraveling. Beyond the window, the night was absolute. The city's sounds finally stilled. Dominic's vehicle pulled alongside them, but a gesture from him sent it away. He preferred to walk. On the impartial territory of a Brooklyn sidewalk, his hand found hers. Clara felt the contact, and her own body, a betrayer, did not retreat. "This is a bad idea," she murmured, the words swallowed by the darkness. He acknowledged her words, a masterful performance of a vulnerability he did not possess. Yet it was she who pressed the moment forward. In response, Dominic paused, turning to her fully. He spoke of a fear so foreign, so intense, it seemed as though she alone had birthed it inside him. He yielded to her comforting gesture, a rare and calculated concession. When she inquired about the future, he asked for her trust, not in his power, but in the man himself. He was imploring her to invest belief in the carefully manufactured persona he had shown her. Clara could perceive every single warning sign, every cautionary signal hanging in the space between them. Yet the sheer gravity of his presence, his unspoken assurances, eclipsed all rational thought. Her heart was making a decision her mind fought against, tying the first knot of a ruinous attachment. The ensuing weeks were a relentless, beautiful onslaught of his attention. Dominic became a fixture, materializing with unsolicited gifts, his name a constant presence on her phone. He was constructing a reality around her, a system engineered for total emotional reliance. He presented her to his mother, Mrs. Caruso, whose effusive and immediate acceptance felt like a final validation. Piece by piece, Clara was integrated into their familial customs, the boundaries of her old life dissolving as she was woven into the fabric of theirs. She met the child Isabella, a 7-year-old girl who became an unwitting pawn in building trust. The girl's guileless affection served to dismantle Clara's remaining defenses, projecting an image of innocence and security within the heart of a dangerous syndicate. Observing Dominic with his niece triggered a profound internal shift for Clara. The formidable enforcer she recognized was supplanted by a man acting out the part of a tender protector. This perfect performance gave her license to compartmentalize the brute and embrace the guardian. During a silent moment of epiphany, she started to reframe his criminal enterprise, not as a moral failing, but as an expression of intense protective devotion. This, her entire view of his violent world, began to contort into something almost holy. To her, loyalty was no longer a restraint, but a distinction he had earned. Each brutal act was reinterpreted as a tenet of a moral code superior to that of ordinary men. This constructed fantasy was the only thing preserving her psyche. She existed amidst the evidence of the truth, strained late-night phone calls, unexplained bruises that would appear on his men. Dominic meticulously managed her reality, insulating her from the visceral sin of his work, thereby protecting the idealized image of him she held. Then one night, the facade crumbled. Dominic became a man of ice, his warmth utterly gone. He attempted to withdraw, but Clara pressed forward, convinced her love gave her passage into the darkest parts of his soul, a hallmark of their toxic enmeshment. Upon learning Marco was injured, she bypassed questions and judgment, offering only the comfort of her presence. With that action, she cemented her position as his sanctuary, a haven where the stains on his hands could be washed away without question. He assured her Marco would survive, explaining the violence as a message from competitors and positioning himself as the righteous avenger. A profound fear took hold of her, but she did not pull away. The connection forged in their shared crises only intensified. "What will you do?" she asked, and his reply was a promise made in darkness. He would defend his family, regardless of the price. She made a conscious choice to hear no further, an act of deliberate ignorance. Having accepted his world, she now had to find her function within its corruption. The boundaries of her world contracted. He moved her into his residence, framing it as a bastion for her protection. Yet a fortress can also serve as a prison, and day by day her existence narrowed, leaving her completely reliant on the man who was simultaneously her savior and her jailer. In the penumbra of his existence, she became an observer of his affliction. The ceaseless nights, the searching gaze, the convulsions of a tormented spirit. What a sane person would see as a warning, she interpreted as a wound only she could mend, pulling her into the vortex of his being. She found him, one evening, amid photographs that haunted the library's gloom. It was a perfectly orchestrated display of vulnerability, an overture to his fractured soul designed to bind her within the myth of their singular, destined union. He labeled the figures in the pictures ghosts, his father and his sister. The girl, Valentina, he called the core of this family. When Clara inquired of her fate, his silence created a vacuum more menacing than any spoken horror could be. He constructed a narrative of a sister lost to a predator, a failure in guardianship he vowed to never allow again. With this, every controlling action, every proprietary look, was masterfully reframed as a scar from past trauma, not the architecture of a cage. She assimilated his version of events, driven to quell his fear of losing her as well. He posed a brutal choice: depart and be safe or remain. His question, why, was a scalpel demanding a verbal commitment to their shared pathology. She renounced safety as a concept, pledging to accept all of him, including his most profound shadows. Their physical union sealed this pact in the ensuing quiet. She had consciously stepped into the nucleus of his perilous, alluring, and condemned world. In the following weeks, her submersion was absolute. By paying her tuition, he acquired her future. His family supplanted hers. The dialect of violence became ambient noise, and she felt her own moral compass begin its slow, final deviation. A new antagonist, a rival named Victor Castellaniano, only served to contract their circle. Conversations would halt when she appeared, reinforcing her position as a sacred object preserved on the periphery of the impending conflict. The facade of security crumbled when she noticed the car, an unknown man, his focus on her predatory and fixed. The abstract danger of Dominic's world was suddenly personified, and it was observing her. Her only reflex was to speak his name. His men materialized like specters to escort her. When she met him, he was charged with a disciplined fury, his concern a desperate, cyclical question. Did he make contact? Did he talk to you? He transmuted his guilt into a tool, blaming himself for her vulnerability. She moved to absolve him, but he named her his bullseye, a beautiful weakness. His words made her dependency on his protection complete. When she inquired about his plan, her tone was that of a soldier, not a subject. He spoke of neutralizing the threat, weaving his impending violence into a grander epic of family legacy. Fear vibrated within her, but her mind had ratified his brutal creed. In the stillness before morning, she made a terminal vow. There was no retreat. She would stay by his side through whatever fire came. Her own survival instinct was now a relic, sacrificed on the altar of their trauma bond. Observers witnessed their shared mania and labeled it a romantic ideal, a love without limits. 3 days later, the war with Victor Castellaniano erupted, and the fire they named love became a conflagration. Clara would forever fixate on the memory of that last morning, the character of the light, the smell of coffee, a child's laughter. She held this perfect, brittle peace as a shield against the storm she had convinced herself was past. The sound of his phone severed the air. She saw the blood abandon his face, his frame freezing with a silent, catatonic rage. His voice, when it emerged, was level and definitive. Castellaniano has made his play. 12 men were gone. 3 warehouses became ash, but the primary assault was a series of her photographs, sent to confirm she was his singular vulnerability. As she looked at her own face, now a target, Clara's reality simply ceased to be. Dominic gazed at the photos and saw not a weakness, but a license to become a god of vengeance. "You do not threaten my family, Mafs," he swore, his voice a promise of complete annihilation. From then on, their world contracted to the size of a gilded cell. Clara accepted this confinement, a prisoner in their own home, while it steadily chipped away at her soul. Watching Dominic, worn down by his war, she became his anchor, trying to hold the center in a world spiraling into bloodshed. His mother's prayers were a constant, frantic whisper in the house, as Clara tried to build a wall of normalcy around the child Isabella to shield her from the spreading dread. She made Dominic eat, made him rest. On the 4th night, he came home, bearing the marks of a vicious fight. The state of him, his shirt shredded, knuckles raw, a new cut bleeding on his face, triggered the clinician inside her. Her voice hardened to steel as she ordered him, "Sit," and began to treat his wounds. He complied like a broken soldier. When she had finished, he reached for her, his voice breaking as he admitted his own vulnerability. He outlined an escape plan for her, a future without him, preparing her for his death. She met his words with a fierce and total negation. She would not permit that ending. He yielded to her defiance, clinging to her like a terrified boy. They took refuge in the memory of their origin, the beautiful bedlam of the night she had always called crashing his party. She required his promise that they would both survive. His vow was not enough. It morphed into a desperate proposal, a fantasy of a wedding they might not live to see, described with the sharp detail of a fever dream. Tears fell down her cheeks as she capitulated to his vision. He pledged a formal proposal, a ring, but only after the danger had passed. Their shared narrative became the only defense they possessed against a crushing reality. Through the long night, they fabricated a life from language, of children, a house and garden, of a future that felt impossibly remote. Their mutual delusion was a fragile fortress against the encroaching darkness. By dawn, their fantasy had solidified into a cause for survival. The final engagement with Castellaniano happened 2 days later. Clara was not present. She only received the fragmented, bloody accounts after the fact. Their rival, Victor, attended a peace talk intending to execute the entire Caruso family. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. He never understood Dominic's influence was so profound that his own guards were already pledged to another. The conclusion was rapid. Victor Castellaniano was taken not in a hearse but in federal custody, buried under a mountain of evidence. The war had ended. Dominic came home a conqueror, but his eyes were hollow, haunted by the battle's ghost. He was catatonic for hours, gazing at nothing. When she finally led him home, he held Clara as if she were the only thing preventing his dissolution. He whispered that the threat was gone for good, then confessed how fractured he felt internally. He vowed to become the man she imagined him to be, a better version. Her touch and her words became the new doctrine by which he lived. Over the following weeks, Dominic started to painstakingly reconstruct himself in her image. With his foe imprisoned, he acted with savage efficiency to legitimize his empire. Stagnant deals were finalized, new pacts were formed in boardrooms. As the family enterprise moved from the shadows to the light, his mother redirected her latent fear into planning a wedding. Isabella, immersed in the fantasy, solemnly rehearsed her part as flower girl down corridors of her own making. Clara discovered a quiet peace, dedicating herself to her work and securing her ideal job at a health clinic in the Bronx. She wove herself into the fabric of his family, establishing a rhythm of Sunday dinners and park trips with the child. This delicate peace, founded on shared time and quiet connection, felt so authentic as to be unbreakable. Nearly 3 months after the violence ceased, a new levity emerged in Dominic. He organized a drive out of the city toward the fiery palette of a Westchester autumn, a tableau designed for a perfect recollection. He stopped before a house of old stone, protected by imposing gates. When she looked at him bewildered, he said only, "We're home." It was their whispered fabrication from that terrible night, now made manifest. He indicated the ideal place for his mother's garden, the field where Isabella could keep a pony. Clara felt the world shift. He had recalled every impossible element from their shared, desperate hallucination. It was the house constructed of hope and dread. He watched her, his confidence evaporated, terrified she would reject it. Through tears, she whispered that it was perfect, and with that utterance, she retroactively sanctioned his entire war. Her acceptance was his prompt. He knelt, a velvet box manifesting in his hand. He opened it, and the diamond inside caught the descending sun, throwing brilliant fragments of light across her features. His proposal was part confession, part prayer. She had redeemed him, he claimed. She had located the man he was supposed to be. She was his absolution, the anchor for a soul that had been lost to the sea. He acknowledged the darkness he hailed from, a brief glimpse of the monster, then promised a lifetime of attempting to be worthy of her light. "Will you marry me?" he asked. She replied by sinking to her knees to join him. Her yes was scarcely a sound. He placed the ring on her finger, sealing their bond. Kneeling together, they were at the summit of their shared illusion, a beautiful lie of a happy conclusion. Their wedding that May would be the start of the final, tragic chapter. They were joined in matrimony at the house in Westchester. For that day, Clara imagined herself a queen. Dominic wept without shame, oblivious to the fault lines running deep beneath their perfect facade, a man convinced he had finally achieved peace. In the foreground of this carefully constructed tableau, his mother wept into her handkerchief, a quiet testament to the family's turbulent history. Isabella, a study in youthful gravity, executed her role flawlessly. Their vows were less a romantic promise and more a treaty, a conscious agreement to reclaim a future from the ruins of their shared trauma. The declaration of their union triggered a predictable wave of applause, yet their kiss transcended ritual. It was a desperate, primal act, a collision of two equally intense souls. The reception that followed was a staged exhibition of influence, where opulence and raw emotion served as twin pillars of the family's new chapter. Clara moved through the requisite dances with her husband, his mother, and an ecstatic Isabella. She later sought refuge on a quiet terrace, a space to confront the overwhelming weight of her new reality and the sheer improbability of her journey. His arrival was inevitable. Mrs. Caruso, he murmured, claiming her hand. What are you feeling? Like I'm in a dream I'm afraid to wake from. Then we'll never wake up, he pledged. After a profound silence under the stars, he pivoted toward the architecture of their future. There is so much to consider. I intend to be fully legitimate in 1 year, not 5, he countered, before we have our first child. Clara turned, her full attention captured. Our first child. If that is something you would want with me. A slow, knowing smile formed on her lips. An interesting proposal. We may need to accelerate that timeline. Dominic went still. Clara? I plan to tell you tomorrow, she confessed. But I cannot wait. She guided his hand to her stomach. You are going to be a father. He was motionless for a long beat before his composure shattered and he pulled her into a fierce hug. Is this real? He asked, his voice strained. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We are around 8 weeks along. He drew back, his eyes glistening. A child? Our child? Our child! An unbridled, joyful laugh erupted from him as he spun her until the stars became a swirling vortex. We must find the best doctors, he began, the plans tumbling out. The nursery, heightened security, and we have to inform my mother tonight, or she will kill me. Dominic! The business, I'll be out within 6 months. Isabella is going to be delirious. Her wish for a new child, born of a sudden grasp of biology, was a sensitive subject. Dominic! His torrent of strategies ceased. His entire focus narrowed to her face. Breathe, she said softly. We have time. We have an abundance of time. The air escaped his lungs slowly, his expression softening into a look of pure wonder. I love you, Clara, beyond anything. And I love you. Let's tell your mother now before her intuition puts it all together. The news, as anticipated, unleashed a matriarchal tempest, a flood of tears, thankful prayers, and a cascade of calls igniting the East Coast. Isabella's reaction was a sonic boom, a shriek of pure elation followed by a stream of hilariously inappropriate baby names. The pregnancy passed in a beautiful, chaotic haze. Clara continued at the clinic, deep into her 7th month, yielding only when Dominic's anxious presence became too powerful to disregard. Their Westchester estate transformed into a true home, anchored by a nursery in pale yellow filled with an army of soft animals. Dominic honored his vow. As Clara began the final trimester, the last connections to the family's criminal enterprise were systematically severed. For the first time in a century, the Caruso name was untainted. It was a reality that had seemed like pure fiction when their paths first crossed. It appeared the sheer force of their connection could indeed rewrite their reality. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, with Dominic as a steadfast presence by Clara's side. The child was flawless, a small, perfect human bearing her father's dark hair and her mother's defined jaw. They named her Valentina, a deliberate echo of Dominic's departed sister. Mrs. Caruso, predictably, was engulfed in a wave of cathartic happiness that spanned several days. The infant's arrival was the intended, final element of their domestic portrait. Cradling her daughter, Clara seemed stunned by the incredible arc of her own existence. Just 18 months prior, she had been a spectral figure on the fringes of society. Now she was a wife and mother, deeply woven into a family that had claimed her with as much ferocity as she had claimed them. Dominic returned from managing his mother's emotional tide. She is asleep now, but your mother was prepared for another hour with her. My mother would hold her forever if we allowed it. He drew nearer, his arms forming a protective circle around them. He whispered, "Thank you." For what? For this, he said, his voice low. This whole reality I didn't know could be real. Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. We created this together, she reminded him. They remained still as the snow accumulated, and a profound quiet settled over the home. Outside their sanctuary, the world continued its painful churn. But within this fragile space, their small family was bathed in the warm light of an immaculate future. 5 years onward, the Westchester house is a place of tangible vitality. Valentina is a force of nature, a child embodying her father's spirit and her mother's compassion, who now rules the home. Isabella, now 12, is navigating the fraught territory of preteen life to the family's collective amusement. Mrs. Caruso occupies the guest house, close enough for connection yet with her own private domain. She has cultivated a sprawling garden that has become a vibrant sanctuary, offering her a deep sense of peace. Clara launched her own clinic, not in the Bronx, but in a different area bereft of care, allowing her to be a true philanthropist. She assembled a loyal staff in a facility that serves as a monument to her vision, where healing is a right, not a privilege, and Dominic, too, had fundamentally changed. The legitimate enterprise he established employs thousands and directs millions toward charity. He serves on hospital boards. His public identity is now that of a philanthropist, not a tyrant. The fearful whispers that once trailed him have been replaced by a hard-won, if reluctant, admiration. But the man underneath it all has not vanished. He would still set the world ablaze to ensure her safety. That ferocious loyalty that first connected them remains unbroken. On their 5th anniversary, Clara awoke to him, watching the sunrise. She slid her hand into his. What are you thinking of? That night, he replied. At the party, you nearly escaped. I did escape. You simply apprehended me. And if I had not? She contemplated that divergent path. I would have returned to my small apartment, reheated food, and fallen asleep to the television. I would have died without knowing this was ever an option. Dominic turned to her, the persona he maintained for the world dissolving. I would have located you, he said, his tone absolute. Our paths were always meant to cross again. You cannot be sure of that. I am, because certain people, they are inevitable. They are constructed to find one another, no matter the distance. A smile touched her lips as she leaned in to kiss him. Happy anniversary, my love. Happy anniversary, my wife. Their celebration was an intimate dinner with their closest relatives. Mrs. Caruso served her legendary lasagna. Isabella presented a scrapbook she had assembled, a thoughtfully told history of their strange, complicated origin. Valentina performed a school song, painfully off-key, and received thunderous applause. Later, with the children asleep, they walked through the moonlit garden. The air was thick with the scent of roses, while fireflies blinked like drifting embers in the darkness. Do you ever long for it? Clara asked quietly. The power, the influence. Not once, he said. The power I hold now is authentic. It is a full night's sleep. It is looking my children in the eye. It is knowing I built something that endures. There is no comparison. She gripped his hand more tightly. I am so proud of you, she said. Of us. What we've built surpasses any future I ever dared to imagine. They sat on a bench under an oak, the same spot from their first night when their future felt like a precarious and dangerous illusion. All right, tell me the next 5-year plan, she teased. A genuine smile, one he showed only to her, appeared. Valentina begins school and likely organizes a takeover by week's end. Isabella will get her driver's license, terrorizing the roadways. My mother will complete her cookbook and inflict it on the public. And your clinic will require an expansion. And us. We will grow older. We'll bicker over minor things and stand united on major ones. We will watch our children mature. There will be good times and bad times and innumerable ordinary days that will matter more than anything else. Tears filled Clara's eyes, born not of sadness, but of the profound beauty of that simple, ideal life. I want that. Then it is ours, he affirmed, sealing their shared, beautiful fiction. They sat in the quiet as the sounds of the evening, a lamp switching on, a far-off owl, spoke of a vast, unfeeling world that had no regard for their private narrative. The woman, Clara, recalled her past self as a ghost, a figure invisible to the world and hollow with loneliness. She traced the improbable series of choices that brought her to this point, reassessing her own tolerance for risk. Her thoughts always returned to the man, Dominic, who had provided what she had craved most, to finally be seen. For what, he feigned, compelling her to voice her own invisibility. For seeing me, she clarified, when I was part of the wallpaper. Dominic's response was a masterstroke of predatory charm. You were the only authentic person there. He then deepened his control by invoking her past fragility. I saw that you were shaking. A classic maneuver in the architecture of dominance. And I could see that you refused to break. That is what I knew. This reveals the predator's core impulse to identify strength in another for the purpose of owning it. Then he delivered the immaculate coup de grace. It has always been you. Clara surrendered her final defenses, her words forging a bond to Dominic Caruso, a perfect study of a captive professing devotion to her monster and maker. She pledged her entire future to him, a promise intended to last a lifetime. He mirrored the impossible vow back to her. The intimacy that came next was not an act of love, but the ritual sealing of an unspoken contract. Upon returning to the house, her body yielded in complete capitulation. This enclosure had finally transformed into a sanctuary. This examination began with a woman who considered herself invisible and concludes with the forging of a lethally intense connection. The female subject found a potent, abstract mooring. The male, the architect of a dark syndicate, in turn, grasped the ultimate axiom of power. True control comes from mastering the deepest anxieties of another. No fairy tale ending awaits these two. Their shared future is projected to be a relentless, violent oscillation between storm and armistice. Each conflict, resolved by a carefully engineered peace, will only deepen the trauma that binds them, reinforcing their pathological codependence. They have built a fortress around their union made not of love, but of unending, self-generating crisis. To those of you who have remained for this grim analysis, I recognize your commitment. Leave a signal below in the comments that you are still present. If this chronicle has made an impression, then please disseminate this study. Let more people become witnesses. Ensure you subscribe for the next installment of this chronicle. I appreciate your time and focus. The concluding lesson is this: the most dangerous chains are always forged when a soul desperate for recognition is finally located by a virtuoso of exploitation.